Welcome to the Voices of Manufacturing, where business leaders across the country share their unique challenges and insights.
We want to help people within manufacturing and make them excited to come to work every day and go home safe to their family.
When you bring people in, they're anything but a machine. They're partners that can help you build your business, that can be your success if you treat them right.
It's almost like magic because it takes the learning process sometimes from weeks down to days, sometimes hours.
This podcast is brought to you by Dozuki, the premier frontline digital transformation solution that allows manufacturers to standardize operations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian Salee and Michael Mullenberg.
So, Michael, this topic today is an interesting one. I know it's not going to apply to all our listeners, but I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think gives folks maybe a different perspective when it comes to quality and how do you, I don't want to say deal with regulations, but how do you work through regulations in order to innovate, especially innovate on the front line. So we're going to be talking about document management and document control and talk about validation. I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with CFR 21 Part 11, which is an FDA regulation that applies to the life sciences industry. And it's, for me, I've experienced it a lot. Obviously through Dozuki, we had a lot of life sciences customers, and it was always one of those nagging requirements. How do we validate the software? How do we make sure we're compliant? But I know you've had some experience with this as well at 3M, and I was curious, when you guys were implementing Dozuki, and I know you've implemented other solutions, how did you work with quality and IT to innovate in these areas that are highly regulated?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. It's kind of a peek behind the curtain. What really happens through change management and some of these external forces. And my standing joke, not meaning to offend anybody, but is we had 91,000 employees, and they could all say no. And the charge was usually led by IT and finance and HR, and of course quality. And so how do you navigate the personal side as well as the departmental, and then those external influences? I think we're going to get into that today in certain industries. And it really is just a fascinating study in change management. We all have barriers of one shape or size or another. And so just how do we keep plowing forward and do the right thing? And I'm hoping we're going to get into some of those success stories as well as the barriers.
Yeah, well, you already got me thinking about this a little bit differently. You mentioned change management. I think, right, that's a huge part of, you want to innovate in a regulated industry. Well, it's getting all those teams, as you mentioned, quality, HR, IT, finance, getting all those folks on board as well. But it's a little bit tougher than, in maybe more traditional manufacturing.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to introduce our guest, Chris Policastro. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Chris.
Well, yeah, we've known Chris for a long time. Chris is a longtime customer of Dozuki and, has a lot of expertise in the life sciences industry. But Chris, you mind giving us a little background, where you've worked in manufacturing previously? I know you weren't always in life sciences.
No, I've actually worked in manufacturing most of my life. I started off as an electromechanical engineer. I worked on designing of industrial machinery and control systems for industrial machinery years ago. Then I moved into IT and eventually ended up in the learning space, digital learning. But previously, I've worked in semiconductor, in the digital learning space, in 2 biotech companies after that. And that's my most recent experience. But used Dozuki, I did the whole Dozuki pitch in my previous 2 biotech companies. So that's what brings me here today, I think.
Yeah, well, Chris, I want to go back because you mentioned semiconductor, and Michael, I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you did, the episode we did with Rodney Babcock, and this quote always sticks in my head when it comes to the semiconductor industry. He said, be careful with those wafers; they're worth more than your house. And Rodney, talked about how influential working in that industry, semiconductor industry, was on him and his focus on quality with his new company, and it had a big impact on him. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what was it like working in the semiconductor industry? And, did that set you up to work in the life sciences industry and for, some of these biotech firms?
Yeah. Well, working in semiconductor, what a lot of people didn't believe when I went into, biotech, I would say, you're dealing with this validation and all these quality regulations. I said, when I worked in semiconductor, it was even more strict. People didn't believe it. They didn't think anything could be more strict than, following, and adhering to the FDA requirements. But the customer audits, like you said, wafers can be thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the semiconductor industry. So customers would come in and do audits, and they would be far more strict. So that industry really taught me a lot about quality control in a manufacturing environment. And for me, moving into the biotech industry and pharmaceutical industry, it was less, it was easier, and nobody in biotech could believe that. They just didn't understand. But it was very similar. All the regulations were very similar in what you had to do to satisfy those regulations. Using work instructions, for example, that was my first introduction to work instructions in the semiconductor industry.
Yeah, it's hard for me to visualize it being more challenging in semiconductor than life sciences, just because I've worked with so many companies in that area, and it's been such a um, what's the word for it? It's I guess perplexing is the probably the best word to describe it. And maybe that's where we should go next is to kind of give our audience, there's folks obviously who are in those industries, regulated industries like life sciences, and understand, what some of the constraints are. But do you mind kind of explaining, this concept of validation and what some of these regulations are that really kind of slow down or inhibit innovation when it comes to, the factory floor?
Yeah, well, I believe that, what takes the time is documentation, right? When we talk about validation, right, it's about safety. It's about making sure that our products are safe for customers. And that means when we use software, we have to make sure that everything we do with the software is exactly what it is intended to be, that there's no possibility of things going wrong. And I would often say to people, the FDA doesn't want to know that something went wrong with software. They want to know that nothing is going to go wrong with software. What did you do? What did you do in advance to make sure that there's minimal risk of something happening wrong? Prevent it if you can. Deal with it if you have to, of course. But, that over time, I believe became a self-inflicted wound to the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. I call it self-imposed overregulation. That's just my own terminology for it. The FDA asks you to go to certain extremes to validate your software. And over time, the companies in the industry have taken it to even farther extremes. So do you need to document everything about software out of fear of something going wrong? Like, especially nowadays, when we go to SaaS applications, they're in the cloud, you know, we want to trust vendors. And the vendors tell us, we're helping you with this validation. We've documented a lot of this for you. But, customers have a hard time trusting vendors because if something goes wrong, it's the company that has to, accept that responsibility. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of validation has to do with, being afraid of something going wrong. And that's good. Fear to a certain extent is good if you're dealing with risk to patients, right? That's a very good thing. That's why the FDA is involved. But self-imposed overregulation, that's what makes validation much harder, I think, than it needs to be.
And Chris, when we're talking about validation here, what's kind of the simplest way to understand it, for especially for someone who's maybe not in the industry, what do you mean by validation?
Well, we're just going to test the software, document the software. What does the software do? What can it functionally do? Does the functionality of the software do what the software says or the software vendor says it can do, the way it is supposed to work? Documenting user requirements and comparing those to the functional specification to make sure that the functionality that the vendor provides can satisfy the user requirements of the customer and testing it testing it along the way to make sure that it functionally does what it's supposed to do. But from a user perspective, it does what it's supposed to do. You're just testing and documenting that software does what it's supposed to do to avoid any errors that could lead to risk.
Does this apply to, obviously software that's running on a piece of equipment? You could totally understand why it's necessary to have validation, or software that's going to be run on like a medical device or implantable device. But what about like, other types of software? We're talking about, obviously Dozuki's a, documentation and train solution. Like it applies to those applications as well. What's the spectrum of solutions that need to be validated?
Sure. Well, uh, I worked in the digital learning space. So the learning management system has to be validated. That's where we keep track of who's trained on what. The document management system has to be validated. That's where we keep track of all the documents and approval workflows and versions. Something like Dozuki for digital work instructions. If you're out on the job following a work instruction in a digital platform, that platform has to be validated. We have to make sure that nothing could go wrong or there's no room for misinterpretation. Just trying to imagine what could go wrong so that we can figure it out in advance and resolve it in advance to avoid risk. And like I say, I keep repeating this, but it's all about patient safety, right? You're working on, drugs or medical products that patients will use, customers or patients. It's a good thing. But again, if it's taking, any good thing could be taken to extremes. So that's what we deal with computer systems validation is it has gone beyond extremes in some cases.
Yeah, Chris, we often heard, from IT, they were also worried about not only just employee safety, reliability of the platform, but interfering with other systems. So creating a chain reaction, which also could be
Sure.
very detrimental to, quality or the patient or whatever. So again, a lot of their questions I found were meaningful, but did we take them to the extreme? How many times do you have to, click that icon until it fails? Is five enough? Is 500 enough? Is 5 million enough? Where do you draw the line? And we would err on the high side always, it seemed, just like you're describing.
Yeah. And you mentioned a very good point that the integrations, like the integration, say, between a document management system where an SOP or a work instruction is created and managed, that has to, be integrated with the learning management system where it can be used as a training tool. So systems can be validated and integrations between systems are validated as well. You validate the systems, and if they're integrated, now you have to validate the integration.
I always use the analogy of back in the 70s, we would build our home stereos with components versus buying one unit that was all integrated. And what's the first question we would ask? Are they compatible? And what wires do you need to connect? But at the end of the day, those piecemeal systems often outperformed. And that's what we were going for all along. So again, great questions to ask as we go, but where do you stop?
Yeah.
That's the challenge we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think one of the other challenges, we talk about the front line often on this podcast. I think that's the people that we're really trying to support when we think of, Dozuki and other applications out there. How do we improve the work that the front lines do and make their jobs easier? And one thing I've noticed, especially with life sciences, is there's this, conservative nature, obviously, for most of these companies, but it's gotten to the point where it's so conservative. I see a lot of companies that say, we'll just print everything and then we don't have to validate the software. And so, Chris, could you give us a little background on that? Like, as a company, you could use a piece of software to, write your SOPs, your work instructions, your training. But then if the operator's just viewing a piece of paper, you don't actually have to validate that software. Is that correct?
Yeah. So if you make a work instruction in Microsoft Word, Word is just the tool that you use to write the work instruction. You don't have to validate Word. Now, the software that you upload that Word, work instruction to, the document management system where it's approved and where version control happens, that has to be validated. But the tool you use to create the SOP with, or the work instruction, does not need to be validated.
And that's mostly because the control is happening in this other system. So there's going to be a check before the operator interacts with it. in whatever it's your document management system with approvals or some sort of
Yeah.
workflow.
The approval and the approval workflow is all about the content, what was written. It's not about how it was written or what tool was used to write it. That's irrelevant.
And I think what's interesting too about this, as we talk about, because how do you innovate? And so many manufacturers, you called it self-imposed overregulation. And so a lot of these companies, they're already burdened. They feel like they're burdened with having to comply with regulations. And so, you know what? Don't even bother. We're just going to print it. We're not going to add another solution that has to be validated. That mindset obviously comes from somewhere, and I believe it comes from maybe two things, which is the vagueness of the regulations, but then also the amount of work that goes into validation. Could you talk about what does it actually look like to validate a software solution? Like what are the steps you have to take? Because it's not a one-time thing, right? It's recurring, and you get to decide, depending on the vendor, when you do that next validation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's broken down into what we call IQ, OQ, PQ. And we don't have to go into the extremes of this, but it's about, the IQ is about, does the system, is it installed and configured, and is it ready for use properly and effectively? You have to verify that. You have to validate that. Right. And then you have to look at the functional spec. What are the features of that software? Now that it's installed and it's ready for use, what are the features, and what do they do for us? Do they do what we expect those features to do? And then the final step is the PQ, and that is the basically user acceptance testing. Does it do those features do what they're supposed to do for our particular, industry, for our particular company, like the instantiation of those features for us. So it's basically examining all of that and documenting all of that and testing all of that to make sure that each of those three parts, the installation and configuration, the functional spec, the features of it, and then the use of those features is the user acceptance testing. And I mean, I just summed that up in a few sentences. You could talk for hours on these things, but that's the gist of it, really. And again, it all goes back to, making sure that it does what it's supposed to do for safety, to avoid risk and be safe.
You summed it up so well and so succinctly that, it doesn't sound too bad, but really, would you say testing, like, I
It
mean,
could
what
take
kind of testing are we talking about here?
an entire platform, or a document management system. Validating could take hundreds of hours and dozens of people. It sounds like, wow, that's pretty quick. We could just like write some documentation, and getting that documentation written. You write a document that's 5 pages long. It could take a week to write it. Now you have to have it approved by 8 people, right? So you started an approval workflow, and 6 people think it's great. And then one person finds a sentence that they disagree with. Well, now you're starting over again, right? So everybody has to agree with that sentence. So it sounds like it should not be a lot of work, but it turns out to be a lot of work. And this is where this newer computer systems assurance is asking us, the FDA is asking us to look at, are we validating what we need to validate? That self-imposed over-regulation, they're questioning that. Are we doing too much? Because it's all time. People don't want to do it or dislike doing it, I should say, because it's just so much time. It's tedious work. Nobody likes to do tedious work. Nobody likes to do testing of, does a drop-down box work? When I select this, does that happen? When I select that, does this happen? Nobody wants to do all that work. So, now we're starting to question, well, why were we doing all that work anyways? That drop-down box doesn't matter. It doesn't cause a risk. And we were validating it
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, knowing, what you've explained here, which, it sounds like an incredible amount of work, a lot of resources, you were at some pretty large biotech firms. And I'm curious, how did that slow down your guys' innovation when it comes to adopting new technology? Was there a stance from the company that, hey, we're just not going to innovate in these areas unless something completely game changing comes in? Or, what was
Yeah.
kind of the philosophy of the organization when it comes to,
Well,
adopting new technology?
It's very sad because on one hand, you have your IT and your digital department saying innovate, innovate, innovate. But because of validation, and the extensive amount of work, the amount of change involved in moving from one system to another and validating it, it just stifles innovation. People will have a mindset of, yeah, I'd love to do that. That's cool. That would be great, but not for us, not in our industry. We can't do that. We don't have time for that. We don't have the ability to make that change. So you end up with an unfortunate mindset of, people saying, no, they're resisting innovation because they don't want to go through the pain of having to do all that validation. And again, if we are spending too much time and we're doing too much work that is unnecessary, that might open up the door. If we agree, we can cut this work in half, right? If we assess the risk of each feature of this software or each outcome of using particular features of software, and we say, wow, there's 10 features here and only 5 of them lead to a risk, so we're only going to validate those 5 features. We're not going to validate all 10 like we've been doing for years, just because we thought we needed to validate everything. So this change in mindset to this computer, systems assurance, and again, I'm not a validation expert. I've only begun to study this. It's basically given the industry a kick in the pants, a slap in the face. I'm not sure what to call it. Saying, what have you been doing? Like the FDA is saying, what have you been doing? We never asked you to do all of that. You came up with all this over documentation on your own. You have imposed this upon yourselves. So we want you to just stop and rethink this. The FDA has given it a new name, and I've watched videos on YouTube from ISPE, and FDA admitting this. We gave it a new name just because we wanted you to think of it as something different, but we're really just trying to get you to rethink and relook at what we've been asking you to do all along. It's always been, look for risks and validate where risks could happen. It's never been validate everything. So
Yeah, but nobody likes vague regulations, right? It's like, tell me exactly what you want and I'll get it done. But when it's vague like that, it's like, well, the whole, CYA, right? I'm going to protect myself and make sure that, I do more than is necessary, which I could see why companies would jump through more hoops than
yeah,
required. And so,
it's logical.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
but let's transition then, we're talking about computer systems validation, and now there's this new approach, and I don't know much about it, so you're going to have to help me out here, but is this something the FDA has already transitioned to, or is it in the works? Where are we at?
Yeah, it's available for use. So I believe it's in some, again, and I'm not an expert at this. I believe it's in some like recommendation state or something like that. It's called at this time, but it's available for use. People are being, companies are being told, to do this. But again, when you look at it and you study it, and it's being worded as, well, instead of compliance based, validation, is risk based validation, but it's always been risk based validation. It's always been done to overcome, risk. But it's really just, like I said, it's more of a slap in the face, wake up industry. You don't need to comply and validate everything. Just look for the risks, medium to high risks. And, we know the risks because the processes, right? Process attributes, I believe they are called. We know with the processes where the risks could happen. So we should be able to know with the software that's automating or helping us, to do those processes where the risks also take place. So it should open the door for more innovation because it will reduce the amount of time we're spending on all this documentation and testing. And again, I personally don't believe it's anything new. Again, it's just a wake up call to do less.
Do you think this was the FDA's response to complaints from the industry that, hey, there's too much regulation and it's occurring in the wrong, phase of the development of the product, right? Like, because I always think about, a lot of these software solutions, it's like this is before the product's even, being made, you're talking about training, and
Yeah.
making sure that my operators know what they're doing. Well, I've also got a control on the other end once the product is made to make sure that the product was made, as intended. And so, there's two checks there, maybe too many checks. So, what are your thoughts on, why the
I,
FDA is kind of changing their stance, or I guess repackaging maybe the same regulation with a different name?
I don't think they liked being blamed for what I keep
Yeah.
calling self-imposed overregulation. I don't think they liked being the big, strong, powerful regulator who's forcing these industries to do all this work. I don't think I think after so many years of people thinking, well, we got to adhere to the FDA, they want us to do this and that. And I think the FDA is probably just saying, hey, no, stop blaming us because you had to spend 100 hours validating a couple of check boxes on a form on a screen. We never told you to do that. So stop blaming us. Take a look in the mirror. This is on you. You've self-imposed all of this work on yourselves that we've never asked you to. So, and again, I've watched some videos on YouTube's where, FDA is basically saying, we even just gave it a name. We sat in a room one day and said, let's just give it a different name to just cause a rift and make people think, well, this is something big and different when technically it's really not so different at all. It's just a wake up call. And it needed a new
Yes.
name, like I said, to draw the line in the sand and distinguish it from what it used to be to what it's going to be, when it's really just getting it back to what it was supposed to be.
So they're tired of being blamed for the waste of overprocessing and maybe the red tape and the bureaucracy, all rolled into one. And yeah, what a clever way of doing it. If it's simply rebranding, that's genius. But just think about all that oppression and that pain on the developer side, saying, I don't even want to innovate because of all this waste. And now they might be saying, hey, it's a little more manageable, and I'm going to go back to my inventive process a little bit. So I mean, it has some serious repercussions if it actually works.
Yep. Yeah. And there is, from what I can read so far, there's it, it's not that there's not anything new. There are to me, there are some small changes, but much of it is about educating companies. You know, how do you assess risk? When you're using a software application, again, then that's helping you to automate a process, some sort of process, right? How do you assess risk? They're even offering training on critical thinking. So what I think that's very wise, on the part of the FDA and ISPE, to say, hey, if we're going to start this over, if we're going to hit the reset button, what has gone wrong? What caused people to overreact? And some of the things they're doing is, writing some guidance on how do you assess risk. If a process changes, if a screen on an information system changes, how do you assess risk? My assessment of risk might be different than your assessment of risk. Can they help people in organizations to, determine how do you assess risk so that we do it the same, so that we reduce it to its minimal state. And again, if it's only validate for anything that's determined a medium risk or higher. Like I said, when we're doing change controls, because we added a value to a drop-down box on a screen, that's insane. Nobody ever asked us to do that. There's no risk in that. I mean, maybe if you add a value to a drop-down box and by selecting that value, something else happens on the computer screen that could lead to a risk, sure. But then you would determine that adding that value at that particular point in time was a medium risk, probably, right? But in most cases, the changes that Dozuki is putting out on a quarterly basis, for example, many of them are small changes that may help you use the software better or understand the software better, but they're not really changing the underlying processes. So there's no reason to have to do any change control you may want to update your documentation to include that. You may want to update your training materials to include that so that everybody is aware of it and knows how to deal with it. But that's different than validation. And it needs to be addressed to stop the madness.
Yeah. Yeah, Chris, I know you and I think similarly in terms of we don't want to be burdened by all that. We want to go to the user, we want to go to the shop floor and say, "What do you think of this?" And I'm trying to
Yeah.
help you and give me some feedback. And so the less burden we have on our backs, the more we can go right to the user and get
It
that
all trickles
feedback
down
before
to
we
the end
invest too
user.
much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it trickles down to
Well,
the end user. But I wake up in the morning to help those end users. That's what
yeah,
I live for.
Yep.
That's what I work for. Everything else is a means to that end. The whether they're operators or technicians or engineers or analysts or specialists, whatever their roles are, right? We're here to empower them. And if we can streamline, this validation process for software, then that helps everyone. Gets the software to people faster. And we talk about, releases. Maybe I'm getting ahead of things here, but you know, if you're going to validate software, how do you keep up with releases? I remember when I first entered a semiconductor factory. They call them a fab, right? And I thought when I got that job, I thought I was going to go into this brand new factory, right? It was in its third or fourth year, state of the art factory, robotics everywhere. I thought I was going to walk into this place and be in this dream state where all software is like the newest versions. We're trying out newer versions. We're ahead of everything. And then you get into the company and yes, it's a fully automated state of the art factory, but your Microsoft Office is 4 versions old. The software you're using to run this factory, everything is 2 or 3, 4 years older than what it could be. And you start to ask, what happened to this place? Why is this true? I wasn't expecting this. And what you'll find out is it's the same story every time. We can't keep up. Validation of the software keeps us, doing so much work that we can't keep up with it. And when a year passes and another year passes, suddenly, you look on the website of a particular software application and you say, "Ooh, that doesn't even look like what we're using." And you see that it's version 13. And then you look on your computer and it's like, why are we using version 9? And it's because you can't keep up with the release cycle with your validation. And that's
Yeah. Well,
when I wake up in the morning to empower an operator and an engineer and they're on 4 versions ago, I'm not doing a very good job of empowering them. I'm failing them.
Chris, this actually goes back to, I think, something we want to hit on here, which is, you've had success at multiple companies now that are in regulated industries coming in and advocating, championing for these new solutions. And
Sure.
I'm curious because I'm sure we have some listeners that are in your position that, they're in a regulated industry. They want to innovate. They feel like they're being held back. And so I'm curious from your standpoint, how do you approach this when you're either, new to a company, you've been at a company, you want to implement some new technology? There's a lot of different stakeholders and groups that need to sign off and buy into this. Like, where do you even start? Like, what's
It starts,
step number
yeah,
one?
it starts before validation for sure. And I have to admit, it's unfortunate, and this could be a weakness of mine, but it takes time to build a network and get involved in the social structure of a company to get to know people. I walked into a company and just said, we should be using this cool new software. And people were like, who are you? Where did you come from? So granted, it does take time just to get to know people. That's the first hurdle. But in the pharmaceutical or biotech industry, if we look at work instructions, right, getting people to want to even try to use Dozuki or even consider trying to use something like Dozuki for digital work instruction. Before we even talk about validation, the first question that our digital quality team is going to ask, the document control team, they're going to say, well, you're trying to replace SOPs with these work instructions. Now they may have SOPs with work instructions in the SOP, or they may have an SOP that references another document that is the work instructions. One of those 2 cases exists. You may even find both of those cases in the same company. And so the first thing they're going to ask is, well, if we use this new software, it has to adhere to the rigor of our SOPs. Now we have all these requirements, again, this is before you even talk about validating the system, user access management of the system, is there version control? Is there approval workflows? If you want, to do that with this new platform, say a Dozuki platform, if you want to use it, it has to adhere to all of those requirements. It has to have all of these features. Now, these features are not being asked by any FDA or any validation requirement. These are just features to manage documents, right? You need to be able to version them and control that and look at older versions. You need to set up approval workflows and state that certain people and certain groups that in a certain sequence can see these new versions and approve them. So one thing that made it easier for me when it came to Dozuki was I looked at a half a dozen different products for digital work instructions, like Dozuki. And I'll be frank, you may cut this clip out. Some of those products did more and better than Dozuki in some ways. It's a fact. Dozuki is a fantastic product. I endorse it and have used it twice. But what they don't do is all of those things that I just mentioned. Within a first phone call, a first 1 hour demo of those applications, they don't have approval workflows. Some of them do version control, some of them don't. So many of them are disqualified immediately. And what made Dozuki shine was, yes, it was great letting you create and manage work instructions, but it had all of these features. It checked all of the boxes.
So, Chris, it sounds like, as we're kind of going through these steps of, if I'm in a company, I'm trying to innovate, maybe solve a particular problem. As you mentioned, step one is, really make sure you've got your network established. You've got some people on your side, some people that'll listen to you.
Yes.
And then it sounds like the second part of it is really being able to define what this new solution is going to enable you to do better than the current solution. It's almost like you're an internal salesperson then at that point.
It is.
Um,
It is.
and how do you go about that? I think that's the other part that, because again, if you're a regulated industry, it's just so easy for stakeholders in the company to say, no, I'm not even interested. I know how much work it took to validate the last program. This would have to be 200 times better than what we currently have for me to do that again.
Yeah.
So yeah, how have you, because you've been effective at, getting
Uh-huh.
people on board. What did you do?
I was very patient and very persistent. They may be two of my key attributes, I suppose, because especially in the first company that I introduced Dozuki to, I probably spent a year and a half. I kid you not. At least a year and a half just demoing Dozuki, and I would just do demos. I became a Dozuki master, right? I mean, no offense, but there were times when I thought, I think I could teach Dozuki some things about Dozuki. I got so good at Dozuki. And I'm doing demos, sales demos. Basically, I'm not a salesperson, but I'm selling it, right? I'm selling it because, again, I wake up every day. I want those operators to have this. I know it. So I begin with them, right? Go do some dog and pony shows, as we used to call it, right? We do some demos and show some of these operators and technicians and such what a visual work instruction is, what a digital work instruction is. And their immediate reaction is, yes, I want that. That's it. That's all I want now. It's the only thing on their mind now is how do I get that? I need that. So now I've planted seeds and they're telling their friends, their colleagues, they're telling their supervisors and their managers. And it took a year and a half in a company, that's got, 100,000 employees of just propagating and selling it. And finally, you get to the point where there's enough people in fairly high levels where somebody wants to start throwing some money at this, right? So we've done a lot of demos. Now we have to do a proof of concept. We do a few proof of concepts so that people can get their own hands on it. Proof of concepts turn into proof of values, which is a proof of concept on steroids, where you start showing, is there a return on investment for this? And in this case, it's pretty obvious, right? There's that if you have these work instructions, there's going to be a benefit. And again, just propagating it through the companies, getting a small start. And once we can get a tool like, say, Dozuki for visual work instructions into a company and get some proof of concepts and proof of values going, it'll sell itself, because it's just so obvious to those operators and technicians that this is going to revolutionize their work. Talk about digital transformation. This is a beautiful example of digital transformation. because it's more than digitizing, it's digitalizing, right? I always talk about that two-letter word AL, you know, digitizing is just turning a work instruction into a PDF form. Digitalizing with the AL in there, that's using a platform like Dozuki that just takes it to a whole nother level, right? It's got all the version control and approval workflows. And, the quality people, kudos to them, because I hate to say this, but they're fighting you all the way. It's their job to do that, right? It's their job to look for the weaknesses. Again, it's all about patient safety, customer safety. It is their job. They have been indoctrinated into jobs in the company where they question everything and look for the weaknesses of the software. And they did. It was a year and a half. To me, it was a year and a half of battles, winning small battles in the company. That's because, the validation creates that mindset,
Yeah. Well, Chris, I mean to interrupt you there, but we're talking about you sell it internally, you get people on board, and then the next hurdle is really the gatekeepers, which often in most organizations, I know Michael experienced this pretty significantly as well. It's quality, and quality says, "No, this is our lane. What are you trying to do?" And this is where I think we see this a
yeah,
lot too, where training, right? You have training and then you have documentation, and they're starting to blend together finally. They've oftentimes been separate. They're starting to blend together. And that's where, you run into these disputes or these challenges where, who's responsible, who's the gatekeeper with
yeah.
these applications. And so, I'd love to hear from both of you on, how do you work with quality to get them to see the benefit and to get past, their mindset that, it's got to be a certain way, because they tend, I don't want to throw quality on the bus, but oftentimes they're less innovative and on purpose, right? They're supposed to be more
By
conservative.
design.
Yes.
Like I said, they're indoctrinated into roles. Well, they might come into the company with these innovative spirits, and they're just broken. They're purposely broken. They are indoctrinated into stop looking out there. Stop. You got to look here and make sure that what you're looking at here and now is flawless, right? And we're waving the patient safety flag. Again, it's always a good thing, right? We're making drug products for people, but they're taking it to extremes. And we need to show them. We need to show them that that's not necessary.
Is it showing them that their job is going to be easier with this new solution? Like what have you experienced? Because again, you've done this multiple times, and Michael, you've done it as well. Like what gets quality to buy in? What was it that made you guys successful in partnering, I guess is the best way to describe it with quality.
I
Yeah,
would
I would
not say
say
that I won that battle. I don't think I won that battle. I think leaders of those operators won that battle, right? When it propagated up from the people who said, we want this no matter what, just get it for us. This is a game changer. It's going to revolutionize. It's going to reduce human error. This is where you start talking quality speak, right? It's going to reduce human error. If you reduce human error, it's going to reduce deviations. Deviation resolution is expensive because it's more time. So you can talk to quality and convince them. I compared the cost of Dozuki, the cost of the amount of time to create work instructions and train people on how to make them and version control them and use them in that tool to the cost of 10 deviations. And it kind of balances out. So now quality people are starting to think, well, if you can eliminate deviations by this software, by using this software, well, now there's maybe something to this. So we're not changing the work that they do. We're not changing the amount of work that they do. We're changing the type of work that they do, right? Because they're still going to have to be involved in this new product. It still has to be validated, and there's still going to be change controls and everything. But there's going to be less dealing with deviations, and I proved that at the first company that we worked at in a particular factory, the first factory where we fully implemented Dozuki. It nearly eliminated deviations that were blamed on human error, which leads to, training, something went wrong with training, or documentation wasn't written well, like an SOP, maybe it wasn't written well. So, yeah, you can convince them, but I think a lot of it also has to do with the leaders of those operators. Once it propagated up high enough, and it was obvious. Right? Think about it. Everybody was saying the same thing. Hey, when something breaks at home, I go to YouTube and I watch a video on YouTube that shows me how to fix this. How come I'm not doing that to do my job with my job at work? This tool allows me to make video clips of step-by-step instructions. This is what I do at home when my toaster breaks. Why am I not doing this at work?
I was going to say, you got me all excited. Like, the best part of my day was when a plant manager would call and say, we hear what you're up to, when's it coming here? Or a division director or somebody in operations. And then it was even better when overseas called, Europe wanted it, Latin America wanted it. So we did the same as you. We created this internal buzz. And over about a 2-year period, we fought the battles with, quality and support. Didn't have the data that you're talking about in terms of benefit yet under our fingertips, right? So we developed this sort of Venn diagram. Finally, it took 2 years and defined, what to do versus how to do it and where that overlaps and how we can kind of support each other on both sides of that equation. Quality loves to tell you what to do. What's the spec? How do you test it? What's the numerical value? And the training, operational work instructions is more how to do the work, how to turn on the oven, how to do the changeover, not the precise specs of the product. And so once we got that diagram out, the conversation really changed, and they saw the momentum, like you observed, and it was kind of hard for them to fight it. But until we had that diagram in front of them, the conversation often didn't go as well. So I think, that moves the conversation forward. Hey, we're here to help each other. And I wish we would have had that diagram, in month number 1. But 2 years better late than never, I guess. And then we had some champions that would, again, like you alluded to, saying, hey, how about that? And, hey, that is making my job easier, and it's preventing errors, and it's maybe even reaching the customer in terms of a quality, achievement of some kind. So takes time to build that story, but we have a very similar path, wins and battles. I love this. And I was we started intentionally in non-regulated, non-medical, non-government areas just because we didn't want to fight that battle early on. And the battle is kind of the same. That's what I'm hearing. It's, red tape is red tape, and over-processing is over-processing. Just call it what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this has been great. This is a complicated subject matter, in a very, complicated industry, highly regulated, but I think you've done a really good job explaining what are some of the challenges and how, if you're an individual, at one of these companies, how do you help innovate and bring new solutions in? So I really appreciate you joining us for this episode.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I'm a Dozuki fan for several years now, so I was happy to get the invite from you to join this call. And if you ever want to do another one, you know me, I could talk all day on these things.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Chris. Yeah, that's the benefit, right? I've been hearing about you for years, and thanks for joining us. And boy, just keep pushing forward. We together, you and I have accumulated, this experience, these skills. I think now's the time we can leverage that and move forward. Take advantage of those bumps and bruises.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Voices of Manufacturing podcast with Brian Salee and Michael Mullenberg. This show is brought to you by Dozuki, the premier digital transformation solution that allows manufacturers to standardize operations. Our website, where you can listen to our episodes and find tons of helpful resources, is Dozuki.com. Sign up for our monthly newsletter so you'll be the first to know about new episodes. That's Dozuki.com, and join us in creating the front line of the future.